What a nice group. Okay. These are real Poe lovers. Yeah, I'm Larry Reed from the Activities Committee, and chose to work with our speaker tonight to introduce him anyway. Chris Semtner is the curator at the Poe Museum downtown, which some of you have been to. He's done tons of stuff that I'm just not going to read here, but he knows a pile of stuff about Edgar Allan Poe. All of my life, teaching life, whether it was for freshmen or grad students, I've always taught a pile of Poe stories, less so with the poems. So we all remember at least one story from school days, like, I don't know, what's the story you remember? The Black Cat. That's the only one. The Cask of Amontillado, yeah. The Telltale Heart, yeah. You've got the big ones. And I don't know whether Chris will talk about those or not, but the implications for those stories will be here. His subject is Pandemics and Poe, and we know that Poe, what's the most famous word in all of Poe? Nah, you got it, right. He'll get to Nevermore sooner or later, I think. So thanks for being here, and I give you Chris Semtner.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm sorry the weather didn't cooperate with us tonight. It's sunny, it's clear, it's just the wrong sort of weather for us. We need something a little bit drearier, don't we? Maybe you can get us in the mood with a little bit of The Raven. Does anybody know some of The Raven? Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary o'er many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, entreating entrance at my chamber door, merely this and nothing more. And it goes on and on. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. So that's probably the most famous poem he's ever written. It's the only poem so popular it has an NFL team named after it. They even have a beer named after it. It's the Raven beer. The tagline of the bottle says, "The taste is poetic." When you're in Poe land, you get a lot of bad Poe puns. You just get used to it. And here's old Edgar Allan Poe. And you've already mentioned the Black Cat and the Telltale Heart, the Cask of Amontillado. But there's another famous story that's actually been adapted to film several times, the Masque of the Red Death. It's the tale of Prince Prospero, and this is from the 1962 film version starring Vincent Price, you see right there, just to the right of center. And he portrays Prince Prospero in the time of a plague called the Red Death. The peasants are all dying, and the symptoms of the Red Death, you start bleeding from your pores. Blood was its avatar and its seal, and within the course of getting it, as soon as you show the first signs, you'd be dead in half an hour. So Prince Prospero says, I'm going to get out of there. Let the peasants die. I'm going to lock myself up in my castle with all my friends, and we'll have a big masquerade ball. So I'll dress up in their costumes, having a good time, and while they're dancing and partying, you can see that somebody's entering the room off there on the left. An uninvited visitor wrapped in the shrouds of the grave, covered in blood. And then as he approaches the scene, at first Prince Prospero is terrified at the sight of him. But then he's angry. How dare this person come and interrupt my party? Who's this party crasher? And then he turns on him and attacks him and immediately drops dead of the Red Death. Then when the crowd in attendance decides to build up their strength and find out who is this fellow, who is this party crasher, they rip off his costume and reveal there's nothing underneath the mask of the Red Death. And of course, they all start to die, and right there where they're reveling, they drop dead of the Red Death. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So this is now one of Poe's most famous stories. It's no Telltale Heart, but it's still a pretty popular one. And when Poe wrote it, when he published it, it was 1842. He's 33 years old. And this is Poe in 1842. You don't recognize him without his mustache. But this is the first published image of Edgar Allan Poe. It appeared in a newspaper at the time with a profile of him saying this is a promising young author. We can't wait to see what he'll do. He hasn't written The Raven yet, so he's not a household name. But it just reminds us that he was a working writer. He worked at magazines a day. This is actually his desk and chair from the magazine where he worked in Richmond. Now take a look at that chair. His boss chopped off the back of his chair to make it uncomfortable so he'd sit up straight and not get lazy. Wants him to focus on his work. And when Poe was working in the magazines, he was publishing his short stories in the same magazines he edited, but he'd send them off all over the place. So at the time he published The Masque of the Red Death, he was working for Graham's magazine, so that's where he published it. So when you're in the magazine business, you happen to have a good idea of the news, what people are reading. So he was in magazines and newspapers, and he knew that a subject that was on everybody's mind were plagues and pandemics, early deaths. This is a time when they hadn't really discovered germ theory yet. They didn't really know what caused a lot of these diseases. But death was becoming an unwelcome intruder, the high infant mortality rate at the time. But if you look at Poe's life, his mother, his brother, his wife all died at the age of 24. So if you're in his family, you're lucky to make it out of your 20s. He only made it to be 40 before he passed away. So this became an age of mourning, and this is a mourning sampler from 1828. They made post-mortem portraits and also had mourning jewelry. And on the right there is a mourning brooch containing hair. This is something to wear while you're mourning. So if you're a woman, if your husband's just died, you dress in all black with a veil over your face for the first 3 months. Then after 3 months, you got to lift up the veil, but you're still dressed in all black. No fancy jewelry. Then after the first year, you're in half mourning. So you're still wearing black, but you get to gradually reintroduce color into your wardrobe. And for the first year, you'd carry this little glass vial on the left. And that's just a little vial called a tear catcher. You'd catch your tears in it, and you get to save them for the first year because you want to carry around your tears with you everywhere. Now, if you're a man and your wife died, you could wear a black armband for 6 months, and you're good to go. You can go ahead and get married. But if you're a woman, you had to go 5 or 6 years before you're able to get married again. You've got to show everybody you're a proper widow. And Queen Victoria, famously, her husband died in the 1860s, and she just mourned for the next 40 years. She dressed in mourning. And she really set the stage for what a good mourner is. Yeah, you really showed you had class if you knew how to mourn properly. And this is old Edgar Allan Poe again, once again, still without his mustache. And at the Poe Museum, we have the world's finest collection of his stuff. So we have things like Edgar Allan Poe's socks. If you ever wonder what Poe's socks look like, we've got the socks. We've got his nail file. We've got his pocket watch, the very watch that was ticking away in his pocket when he wrote those lines from the Telltale Heart. And now a new sound came upon my ears. It was a low, dull, quick sound, almost like that made by a watch when enveloped in cotton. I knew it well. It was the beating of the old man's heart. Well, we've got the watch. It's not enveloped in cotton. We have it showed off for everybody to see. Another nice thing we have is a Poe family Bible. And when we look through the Bibles, of course, you've got births, you've got marriages, but also pages and pages of deaths. And you can see just from looking on here, a lot of people are dying early. The first one, 1816, age 3 years. The second one, aged 1 year. And there's even this little clipping there, the death of Poe's cousin George. And if you look really closely, it does give the cause of death, yellow fever. This is a pretty common killer back then. In fact, this scene from a painting by Theodore Géricault at the VMFA is a scene from a yellow fever epidemic. This is something that happened pretty much every summer in the late 1700s, early 1800s along the coast. You would see people gradually, they'd start to turn yellow. They'd get a high fever and delirium. They're ranting and raving. Their organs are shutting down. That's why they're starting to turn yellow, and then they feel like they're better. Very often they got better, and then it just got worse. They just started vomiting up black bile. So that's the phases of it you see in this early illustration. So that's the vomiting phase of yellow fever. And this got so bad that here's a scene from Philadelphia in 1793. This is where our nation's capital was at the time. They hadn't settled in Washington, D.C. yet. And they were struck at that time with a horrible pandemic of yellow fever. People were dying left and right. But since it was the capital, George Washington was president, they had to abandon the capital. And this lady right here, I don't know if you've heard of her, this is Dolly Todd. She lost her husband in that epidemic. Now we know her because her second husband was James Madison, so now we know her as Dolly Madison. So this is something that touched people at the time. They knew it pretty well. The leading physician of the day was Benjamin Rush, and he published a book about the yellow fever, observations upon the origins of the malignant bilious or yellow fever in Philadelphia and the means of preventing it. So this is a whole book published at the time about what caused this pandemic, what's the cure for it. And here it says, the cause of this epidemic, like that of all epidemics, was in the atmosphere, which had at that period undergone some change destructive to the purpose of life by an unusually hot and dry summer and autumn. So they thought it's bad air, or they call it the miasma theory. You got sick because the air was bad. And alarmed by its appearances, the physicians took their idea of treatment from its terminating symptoms and began, according to custom, with bark, wine, cordials, with the most powerful external as well as internal stimulants. That was the cure. Give them bark and wine. Or you could bleed them. You know, if the problem was they got too much blood, you could go ahead and bleed them. But eventually winter came and it disappeared, and they weren't sure exactly, well, maybe the cold air is better than warm air. What could be causing this? They knew that Philadelphia had this large waterworks here. They cleaned the water as well as they could. What could be spreading this disease every summer? Turns out it was mosquitoes. Now, I mention this because this is when Poe's mother enters the scene. 3 years later, she came to the United States. She was 9 years old. She was a traveling actress. She made her debut up in Portland, Maine, playing a little tomboy character called Little Pickle. And she had a hit song called The Market Lass, another hit song called Nobody Coming to Marry Me. And she toured up and down the East Coast, all the way from Portland down to Charleston, South Carolina. But along the way, she had a pretty rough life. The theatrical circuit always had to take into account where the next yellow fever outbreak was. So in South Carolina, she lost her mother to yellow fever. And Eliza, Poe's mother, here was only 11 years old. Then, a couple of years later, she lost her stepfather to yellow fever in North Carolina. Then at age 15, when this portrait was painted, she got married, and she lost her husband to yellow fever here in Virginia, in Fredericksburg. And then she got married a second time to a fellow named David Poe Jr., who's also an actor. He's just pretty bad at it. Said he got booed off the stage on a few occasions and actually started threatening the audience on the stage, challenged a critic to a duel over a bad review. And then he abandoned her. And he ended up in a debtor's prison up in New York, where they believe he also died either of tuberculosis or yellow fever. But her tour kept her on the road, and she came to Richmond. This is a city she had a lot of associations with. She'd married her second husband here. This was one of her favorite stops. But unfortunately, this is where she met her end. And not of yellow fever this time, she died of tuberculosis. But this is Richmond in her time, already pretty well known for the Virginia state capitol, the first neoclassical public building in the New World. This set the model for state capitals all over the country to look like ancient Roman temples. And Poe grew up here with foster parents. So Edgar and his brother and sister all orphaned. He was a month short of his third birthday. So he never knew his mother or his father. He only knew by reputation. And you know the couple that took him in, their last name? Allan. They gave the middle name of Allan. If it hadn't been for Richmond, he wouldn't have the middle name of Allan. So he grew up playing in the James River. He actually, to this day, holds a record for swimming against the tide in the James River at 6 miles. And we had a guy come to the Poe Museum a few years ago, and he had the swim fins and everything, and he said, I'm going to beat Poe's record. Never heard from him again. He might still be out there for all we know. But Poe was great and athletic. Of course, he was a great student, so when the time came, he went to the best university in the country, the brand new University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was actually still alive when Poe got there. Do you guys remember which day Jefferson died? July 4th, 1826. He waited for the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and Poe was there at the time. Although Poe has an alibi, Poe didn't do it, but he did attend Jefferson's funeral. But the problem is, while Poe was there, he finished up the first year, 4th in his class in Latin, 5th in his class in French, really excelled at languages. But back home, his foster father wasn't going to pay for him to go to college. This was too expensive. So Poe started gambling. And he got himself about $2,000 in debt after the first 9 months, and he really couldn't stay at college anymore. So he came back after the first year at UVA and returned home to find out his fiancée had broken his heart. She was going to marry somebody else. So he ran away from home. At the age of 18, he stowed away aboard a coal ship, and that took him to Boston. He published his first book, which was a dismal flop. Nobody bought it. It's called Tamerlane. There's only 12 copies that still exist. He didn't even own a copy of his first book. So he said, I should have adventures. I should see the world. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. And they sent him down to Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, Fort Moultrie. Then they took him out here to Fort Monroe in Virginia. And he said, you know, being an enlisted man, that's not good enough for me. I need to be an officer. So he hired somebody to take his place and serve out the rest of his enlistment for him so he could go to West Point. So you could hire people to take your place back then. Even during the Civil War, you could hire a substitute. So you never guess how he came with the money to pay for the guy. No, he just said, my foster father's rich, he'll pay for it. And the foster father, of course, didn't pay for it, so that got him into more trouble. So he did get to West Point, and he was there for about 9 months before he was court-martialed and expelled for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. So that wasn't for him, so he moved down to Baltimore with his biological father's sister. He never knew his biological father. He died early, but his sister was named Maria Poe Clem, and she was a widow living in Baltimore with Edgar's grandmother and Edgar's brother and her daughter, Virginia. And shortly after Poe moved there, it's just about a year after he moved to Baltimore, something new came to the United States. It came across the ocean. It was called the cholera. And this is something they hadn't really seen before. It started in India. This was a global pandemic, started in India, worked its way across Asia to Europe, millions of people dying in its wake. It went down to Africa, then it came to the Americas, and the disease just caused massive diarrhea where you just became dehydrated over the course of a day. Your skin starts to turn bluish gray. So you see a lot of depictions of people looking a little bit bluish gray. And this is the appearance after death of the victim of the Indian cholera. And once again, they weren't quite sure what caused it, but they knew it came seemingly out of nowhere. And then body after body was being pulled out of the city, taken to big mass graves on the edge of town. And Poe would have seen this while he was there. He actually describes in one of his letters what it was like being in Philadelphia during one of these cholera pandemics, and just the city was a ghost town. If you could afford to get out of the city, you fled. You got as far away as you could. Just like Prince Prospero, you locked yourself up. You stayed away from everybody else because those people are all dying. I want to get as far as I can from the bad air. That's this miasma that's causing this. So you see depictions from the time of people dead in the streets and posters like this going up warning people about this. The cholera attacks, the debilitated, the sufferers from deficient and unwholesome food, from bad and dirty clothing, and from ill-aired, damp, and crowded dwellings. From these low dens, cholera heaves upward and seizes puny children and adults and the feebly aged. In mansions, too, where wealth and luxury are now powerless protectors, this atmosphere of most terrible disease seems to roll towards us from its birthplace of filth and dissoluteness in the east. So it says so the only way to cure it is to say, right at the bottom there, sober, virtuous, cleanly. So how do you protect yourself? This poster says, be temperate in eating and drinking. Abstain from cold water. So cold water is bad for you, and above all, from ardent spirits. So stay away from alcohol. A lot of these, one of the main things, like here, number 3, beware of the drink. So this is caused by low living and filth and dirtiness, but stay away from alcohol. Whatever you do, drink more water, as long as it's not cold. And these are some characters of the time, the court of King Cholera. This shows you, they assume, well, this is the poor people in the busy cities. The reason it's spreading so quickly in the cities is because a lot of people cram together. It's spreading within the household. And these are doctors searching everywhere, looking through windows, looking under houses. This guy's looking in the trash to find out where the cholera is coming from. But now we can look back and see, well, we know where it's coming from. It's coming from the water. They're all drinking from the same water supply, and their waste is going into the water supply, and that's spreading the cholera. And we can see even from this map of Richmond at the time, we've got a turning basin right in the middle. The canal cuts through everything. People are throwing their waste in there. They're also getting water out of there. And these are just some statistics you can't see from back there, but it's showing just how many people were dying each year of the cholera. Just imagine 1832, population Richmond's about 15,000 people. And we can see that there's 453 people died in Norfolk, 494 people died in Richmond. And then I guess that's a total there. That's the total number. They have the percentages, and then they have the total number. So this is another depiction of the cholera finds you wherever you are. And about this time was reported in a newspaper article written by one of Poe's future friends, Nathaniel Parker Willis. He had gone and he'd heard about these people in Paris. Now, Paris, about 10,000 people died. And he wrote about some people who took over an opera house. And they decided, well, if we're going to die anyway, let's have a big death party. So let's have a masquerade ball. We'll all dance and party because we're just going to die. Life is short. And while they're throwing their big party, somebody showed up as the embodiment of the cholera, as the death head. And we're pretty sure that Poe read this article because it sounds pretty similar to the Masque of the Red Death, where this figure dressed up as the embodiment of the death, almost like the Grim Reaper shows up at the stroke of midnight and everybody dies. And that same year, Poe wrote a story, Shadow, a parable. And this is about some ancient Egyptians during a time of a plague. They're all gathered around the body of their deceased friend, just waiting for death to approach. And then they hear a voice, unlike any voice they've ever heard. It's the voice of every loved one they've ever had, all combined into one. All these people they've lost before, their voice is calling them in unison. And 3 years later, while he's working at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, he wrote a story called King Pest. And this one is set in London during a plague, and it's about two drunken sailors. It's a comedy. It's a Poe comedy, so it's not really funny to other people but him, but these two drunken sailors stumble into a bar and find out people are having a death party. They're all sitting around drinking out of human skulls. There's a skeleton hanging from the ceiling to light the room, and one of them's already in his coffin. His armholes punch out the side of his coffin so he can keep drinking. That way he doesn't have to fall very far when he dies. And Robert Louis Stevenson, who read Treasure Island, he wrote Treasure Island, he said, "Whoever wrote this has ceased to be human." How can you write such a story in bad taste? And one of Poe's later lesser-known tales is The Sphinx, and that's set during another cholera outbreak, and this time he has the characters, they've fled New York City and they're out in the countryside just to escape cholera, and all of a sudden this strange beast with a death's head on it shows up. But you have to read the story to find out what the beast really is, although the illustration kind of gives it away. It's just a death's head moth that's on the window, and he thinks, from sitting too close to it, he thinks that it's actually a giant one instead of a little one. See, it doesn't work too well. But we've got a lot of newspapers in our collection with different cures for cholera. These are newspapers from the time. So this is preventative of cholera. It has been fully ascertained that persons working in horse stables and poultry mills are exempt from attacks of cholera. This is thought to be owing to the ammonia which is exhaled from these offensive substances. So maybe it's the stink coming from the cow manure or the horse manure that prevents the cholera. Hence, hartshorn is now prescribed for this disease, so this is ground up antlers that you're supposed to drink. The dose at the appearance of the first symptoms is from 15 to 20 drops of spirits of hartshorn and a wine glass of water. So again, the water, what's spreading it. The patient is relieved in less than 20 minutes. In more advanced stages of the attacks, the dose is to be repeated in short intervals until the effect becomes manifest. That's just assuming the water doesn't have the bacteria in it. We can see even President Polk, James K. Polk, shortly after he left office, he also died of cholera, and this is a notice of his death. It says from his chronic diarrhea. Here's even a weekly report of deaths from 1849, from the summer of 1849 from New York City. And when we zoom in on it, the diseases it lists here, just in 1 week, 317 people died of cholera, 31 of cholera infantum, 10 of cholera morbus, only 48 of consumption, 25 of diarrhea, and right after diarrhea, one person died of drinking cold water. So watch out for that cold water. But fortunately, medical science had already come a long way during Poe's lifetime, so they had a great cure-all. It's called calomel. And this stuff, if you had yellow fever, tuberculosis, cholera, whatever you had, calomel will take care of it. You probably can't tell the ingredients, but it's made of mercury. And when Poe was in one of these cholera outbreaks in Philadelphia, his doctor prescribed he take some calomel. He said, take it till your gums start bleeding, then you know you've had enough. And he complained in one of his letters he wasn't sure what was worse, the cholera or the cure for the cholera, because that was making him kind of dizzy and making him lightheaded. He didn't like this so much. And we've tested his hair, and just a single strand of his hair. You don't have to test very much hair to get some good results, but they said that in the last few months of his life, after he started taking these mercury pills, his mercury levels went up 264%. So that wasn't helping you, but they still thought this was a great cure-all. And this is a prison where he was admitted for drunkenness that last summer while he was in Philadelphia. And he said while he's in prison, he had a vision that an angelic figure came to him and told him, follow me. And she took him up carried him up into the sky over the city of Philadelphia, and he looked down at all the dead and dying being carted out of the city. And then he found out that she was a big black bird, and she cried out, I am the cholera, I am the cholera. And so this is a vision that Poe had according to one of his friends that Poe told when he got back to Richmond. So maybe this would have been one of Poe's short stories if he'd lived long enough to write it. But here's two pictures of Poe. The one on the left is from November 1848, and the one on the right is from the end of September 1849. So not quite a year apart. But people say just from looking that you can tell that after that cholera epidemic, he had lost a lot of weight. His eyes are starting to look sunken. And that's not even a year's time here. So maybe people are just drawing too much into the pictures. But eventually they did figure out that the cholera was in the water. They weren't sure exactly what caused it since they didn't know quite about germ theory yet, but they thought there's something in that water that's causing it. The problem is, as you see here, when there's a hearse on the right, they're carrying the body out to the hearse, but all their linens, their soiled linens, they're washing them in the canal here, which is probably also going to be the source of their drinking water. So Poe is lucky to have survived that. He complained that he had spasms and he was vomiting, and that seems to be the worst of it he got, but he did survive. So this is one disease that Poe knew pretty well. And here's Poe's wife, Virginia. And he just adored her. He never had a whole lot of money, but no matter what he had, he gave to her. He made sure she always had a piano to play. He loved to hear her play the piano and sing while he played his flute. And they make beautiful music together at night. So when they're living in Philadelphia, it was February of 1842, so very early 1842. And as she was singing, she started coughing up blood. And they realized, oh, this is a symptom of tuberculosis, that she has it. He'd already seen his mother died of it, his brother died of it, his foster mother died of tuberculosis. He knew the symptoms well, and now he knew that she had it, and it's a death sentence. They didn't know what to do for it. They didn't know how to cure it. One of the cures they had back then was sitting outdoors in the cold weather without a coat on and hoping the cold air would help your lungs. And during this time, a fellow took a bunch of people to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. The idea was that they live in the cave, and the air inside the cave is always kind of cold. It stays about 50 degrees year-round, so the cold air would help them. That didn't help them either because they didn't have any sunlight, so that just made them worse. But this was a very common cure at the time. So you see a lot of artwork from the period depicting people dying of the consumption. And it said that in urban areas, people were just crammed in there together. There's a huge population explosion during Poe's lifetime. When he was born, the population of the nation was about 7 million people. When he died, it was 21 million people. A lot of it was immigration coming in, and just the cities' populations were exploding. They said that as many as 75 to 95% of the people in the cities were carrying tuberculosis. A lot of them, it just was in their lungs. They were asymptomatic. It didn't bother them. But then some people were suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis, where it affects the lungs, or there's skeletal tuberculosis, where it's affecting your bones, or there's even tubercular meningitis, where it starts to affect your central nervous system. And some people think that actually Poe might have suffered from tubercular meningitis. Well, we've already spoken about his mother dying of this disease, his foster mother. Even one of his girlfriends, Frances Sargent Osgood, died of tuberculosis. So all around him it seems to be. So it's likely that he was exposed to it, probably was carrying it. And this is a French woman, Marie de Plessis, and she was notable for being tubercular, from really popularizing the consumptive look. And that was all the rage back then. You would put on some lead white face makeup to make yourself look extra pale, and you try to be as gaunt as you could. Here's a caricature from the time showing a woman with the consumptive look. And they just romanticize the idea of this horrible disease. And you wore fashions that accentuate that hourglass figure to make you look very thin and gaunt. And very often one of the accessories of the time was carrying a little handkerchief like that. And if you look at a lot of these handkerchiefs from the time period, they would often have red roses or apples or strawberries or little red designs to camouflage the blood when you coughed up blood. And we actually have, here's a handkerchief case that Poe's sister painted. She paints some little red roses on it, but the pigment she used has faded away, so all you see are the leaves around the roses. So a lot of novels from the time, you have characters wasting away of consumption. So look back at some of those early 19th century novels. It's like pretty much every other girl's wasting away from the consumption. Even Poe wrote a lot of stories about women wasting away from consumption. And his first published short story, nobody's ever read it, but it's called Metzingerstein. And he wrote about the beautiful Lady Mary. How could she die? And of consumption. But it is a path I have prayed to follow. I wish all I love to perish of that gentle disease. How glorious to depart in the heyday of the young blood, the heart all passion, the imagination all fire, amid the remembrances of happier days, in the fall of the year, and so be buried up forever in the gorgeous autumnal leaves. Thus died the Lady Mary. So yeah, they idealize, they romanticize the idea of this horrible disease. And in Poe's day, we're kind of at the height when the cities were just overwhelmed. But you can see this on the left side is 1838. And you can see there's 1850. It goes all the way to 1970. You can see the cases, the death rate from tuberculosis in the United States. So we're looking at 1890 about when they actually identified what was causing it. So Poe died in 1849, so he's way on the left side of here, just by the 1850. So he's still at a time when it's really running rampant. And what we finally did to help alleviate it, we developed antibiotics, which helped take care of this. But it just didn't save his wife. And shortly after she got sick, he knew she was dying. He knew there was nothing he could do about it. And there were times when she got really sick and she thought, this is the end. He'd prepare for her funeral. Then she'd get better. And he thought, oh, she's cured. Whatever we did something right, she's cured. And then she gets sick again. And he said of those years of her illness that felt like she was dying over and over again, he said, I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. So horrible sanity was seeing what the world was really like around him, to see what his wife was going through. And the insanity was escaping it with drink. He knew that after about a glass of wine, he was staggering drunk, so he could escape it only through that, because every time he looked to see what his wife was going through, he was just devastated. He couldn't survive like this. So I told you that February she got sick, and by the spring he published a story called The Oval Portrait, or we call it The Oval Portrait now. And it's about an artist with a beautiful young wife. And he takes her home to this beautiful castle, and he wants to paint the most lifelike portrait of her ever. So he slaves away at this beautiful portrait, not paying attention to her. He's so focused on making the greatest portrait ever. When he finally completes it, he looks at his painting and says, this is life itself. Then he turns to see his wife has wasted away and died. So it's tempting to think that here's Poe thinking, I've made my wife suffer. I've devoted myself to writing, even though I can't make a living at it, even though I'm going from one magazine to the next, barely making ends meet. Maybe if I'd done something different, maybe if I'd worked in the import-export business like my foster father, I could have taken care of her like she deserved to be. And so maybe this story looks a little bit like he's blaming himself for her death and for his inability to do anything about it, even though now we can look back and say, well, there really wasn't anything you could have done about it because you didn't have the antibiotics that we could have used to treat it. And I say that now we call this the Oval Portrait, but in his time it was called Life and Death. That was the first printing. He changed the title later. And then the story that came out after that was, of course, the Masque of the Red Death. So it's tempting to see how these things all lead up to one another and culminate in the Masque of the Red Death, written at that period when she'd shown the first signs of tuberculosis when she'd sewn that blood. And just like in the Masque of the Red Death, blood was its avatar and its seal. Blood was the sign of this deadly disease. And since this became one of his most adapted short stories, it's been adapted to comic books and illustrations, even movies. So this is the famous one we all know with Vincent Price, just one of his many Poe movies he did during the 60s. You've probably seen a few of them. They come on every year around Halloween time. There's The House of Usher, The Tomb of Ligeia, Tales of Terror, of course, The Masque of the Red Death. But there's other ones. This one stars Frank Stallone, who's Sylvester Stallone's little brother. This is one from about 1989. But it's become part of our pop culture. It shows up. This is a copy of The New Yorker with The Masque of the Red Death on it. Even there was a French author, Gaston Leroux, who loved Poe's writing. And when he was writing The Phantom of the Opera, he incorporated The Masque of the Red Death into it in one of the scenes. So you can see the characters dressing up like the Masque of the Red Death. But this idea of, stories focused on plagues and pandemics continue today. And we think of Stephen King's The Stand, but also movies like Contagion. And we can see that even today people are grappling with those same issues. And I first gave this talk about 4 years before the whole world shut down. And we were thinking, well, good thing nothing like that will ever happen again. And then, 2020 and everything shuts down. So it's still something that we're dealing with today. But Poe's moral to the story, he didn't really like to have morals to his story. So this is how he ended The Masque of the Red Death. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So that's not the most cheerful place to leave it. So I'll leave you with a picture of Poe. And if you do happen to visit the Poe Museum, we've got cats. Edgar and Pluto, black cats. They come and visit everybody. So some of you saw the screensaver at the beginning that had black cats on it because we have cats running around the museum. Even when we have school group tours, we had a lot of 7th graders there. Imagine a bunch of 7th graders come out. They've just read The Black Cat. They step out the gift shop door into the garden, and Pluto, the big black cat, runs up to them and jumps over the hedge to greet them, and they scream, and it's just perfect. We thought, we've done our job. So we've got a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? And I think she can get you the microphone if you need it. Yeah, we've got one right back there.
You must have done a lot of research to get all this together. Where was the best place to find the information?
There are a few different places you can find. You can look up the mortality statistics for the different cities by looking at the old newspapers at the time. You can find a lot of the period newspapers on loc.gov. It's the Library of Congress's website. And then there were a few different books I used. I can't recall the titles right now, but I was doing research originally for an exhibit we did called Pandemics and Poe. And we thought, that might make a good talk too. I've got one over there.
I'm really curious, how did you get so involved in this and to the extent of becoming involved with the Poe Museum and doing all that you've done?
Well, I started working there because they needed somebody with some art experience who could do some conservation work. They had an 18-foot wide scale model of Poe's Richmond with little bitty houses, about 3 inches tall, and they needed somebody who could conserve that. So I started out doing conservation restoration work and worked on different objects, and then they had me get into doing the exhibits, and the librarian retired, the curator retired, so I sort of took over more responsibilities for them, and then I started doing research on different aspects of Poe. So we wanted to make sure that people knew about the importance of the collection, so I wrote a book called The Poe Shrine, all about the collection at the museum, the different artifacts and how we got them. So it just snowballs from there. There's always something new to learn. And for a while there, they had me doing a new exhibit every month. So I had to completely research. One exhibit was all about Poe and mummies. He actually wrote a story called Some Words of the Mummy about reanimating a mummy using electric battery or galvanic pile. And one of them was all about the theme of madness in Poe's stories. I remember there's a good book about that, Madness in America, that gives you a good background on early 19th century views on mental illness. So more and more that you learn, the more research you do, and then every time somebody brings a new artifact for you, you end up taking a deep dive into researching that and find out, well, they say they have Poe's table. Now we have to research this table. Is this a table that's typical of Poe's time period? What's the provenance of it? Somebody might come to me with a ring they say is Poe's ring, and we have to often research exactly what the paperwork says. How'd it come? Can we disprove any of this? But there's still things showing up today. Just in the past year, we've unveiled about 70 new artifacts that people have given us. Another question?
Is the museum, how is the museum funded?
It's privately funded. We're a private museum, so a lot of it comes from admissions and gift shop sales and from donors.
Okay, so you have a foundation?
Yeah, we have the Poe Foundation runs it.
Okay.
And we've got,
And I understand you're also, now, I remember visiting the Poe Museum, probably in the early 70s, and there wasn't much there, as I recall. Maybe I was just not paying enough attention, but now I understand that your host, it's used as a venue for weddings?
oh yeah, they have perfectly normal people get married there. It helps if you're weird, but you're still allowed to get married there if you're normal.
And in the garden primarily,
Yeah, right out
right?
there in the garden. The center of the museum is a beautiful garden landscaped in 1921. It's based on one of Poe's poems. So the garden itself is a living, breathing Poe poem. It's based on the lines from To One in Paradise. Thou wast it all to me, love, for which my soul did pine. A green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and a shrine, all wreathed in fairy fruits and flowers, and all the flowers are mine. So it's got a green isle down the middle, a fountain and a shrine, and it's full of flowers and trees and shrubs that Poe mentioned in his poems and short stories. So right now, if you visit, you'll see roses and lilies and daisies. And lilies are the flower he mentioned most often in his work, so we've got lots of big, tall, 4-foot-tall lilies out there all over the place. But the collection really has grown since the 70s. We got a lot of significant gifts in the 1990s. Great-great-granddaughter of Poe's cousin, Eliza Herring, gave us Poe's vest and socks and other clothing from the family. And then just in recent years, we've got things like Poe's pocket watch, the ring he gave to his last fiancée just about a month before he died. We've got people come out of the woodwork. Now that we have the internet, people, if they have this Poe artifact they've passed down through their family, they can say, where should I give it? And they can Google Edgar Allan Poe or museum and find us. And so we have people from really all over the country will contact us and let us know they have this artifact they think would belong there. We had a guy from Michigan who told us, I have Poe's pocket watch, and I have Poe's pocket knife. And it's got Poe's name engraved on a little silver plate on the side, and we were able to trace back the history of it and find out how he got that. And then we got to meet all sorts of interesting people. His last fiance's great-great-great-grandson, who gave us a little drinking glass that Poe had given his last fiancée in the last summer of his life, or even a really nice letter that Poe sent to Edward Valentine the year before he died. And Edward Valentine's great-great-great-granddaughter lives out in Lynchburg, and she told us, I've got this. Well, it's not the Edward Valentine, the sculptor, Edward Valentine, his foster mother's cousin. But yeah, so the people are out there, and now we're more accessible thanks to the internet. And just today, we had a group from VCU come in, and they did 3D scans of some of the artifacts. So what they do is they put a little machine, and the scanner goes all the way around it, and they can reproduce all 3 dimensions, so people online are going to be able to look at the things, turn them around, see what the bottom looks like. If you visit the museum and you see the trinket box that Poe's wife owned, imagine her holding this, but you can't look underneath it. because we don't let you touch this stuff. But the virtual image online, you'll be able to flip it upside down, look at the bottom, or you'll be able to, hey, what's inside? And we can print out 3D copies of things this way too. We've got the key they found in Poe's pocket after he died. We've made a 3D copy of it, so when we give a tour, we can show people the key, then we can hand around the little copy of it that people can hold, get a feel for it. So yeah, technology is really bringing the collection into a new sphere. I don't even know if that even answered your question. Any more questions? Oh, we have one up here. No, Poe doesn't have any direct descendants. He never had any children, and his sister and brother didn't have any children either. His brother died young, and his sister never married. But she had foster family, so her foster family took care of her, and her foster family's descendants gave us things over the years, because she inherited things when her brother died, and then she gave them to her foster family's descendants, and they gave them to the museum. But there are descendants of cousins, and they'll call themselves Poe's cousins, even though they were born 100 years after he died. Yes?
How well known is he elsewhere besides Virginia?
Oh, he's probably better known elsewhere.
Really?
Yeah, one of the presidents of our board, he did a whole tour of Russia a few years back, before the whole war thing, but they got to see Russia, and people over there knew the stories over there that people don't read here, like the man of the crowd. So they really take Poe seriously over in Europe and in Asia. And about 4 years ago, I went to Kyoto, Japan, and spoke at a Poe conference. So there's a Japanese Edgar Allan Poe conference over there, and people know him also because of pop culture. He's been on The Simpsons. He's been on South Park. Netflix has a show coming out in the fall called The Fall of the House of Usher, which stars the guy who played Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars movies, and he's going to be on this Edgar Allan Poe TV show on Netflix. But yeah, they've made about 250 movies based on his works, and not just in the United States, but all over the world. So sometimes people come here and they'll come to the museum and they'll say, wow, I've never read The Raven in English before. I've only ever read it in Spanish or in French or Korean. And so it really helps you form a connection. We've translated our self-guided tour into German, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, and Mandarin. So we get people all over the world to come to us and say, hey, can I read it in my language? So we try to oblige them. Do I have any? Oh, there's one over here.
I have two questions. What was Poe's actual connection to the Poe house where you work? And the other is, what's the source of these formal portraits, the photographs? Did Poe sit for them? Did he pay for them? Or
Okay, the first question is, the Old Stone House is one of the buildings at the Poe Museum. So there's 4 buildings in all, and the Old Stone House is the one that was there during Poe's lifetime. It's a place he visited when he was growing up, but he never lived in that house. The time he visited would have been 1824. The Marquis de Lafayette was in town. And this is long after the Revolution. So Lafayette was a teenager during the Revolutionary War, but so this is years later. And Poe was on the honor guard that escorted Lafayette around town, so they would have stopped at that house while Lafayette went inside, got all the attention. And the garden itself is made of bricks from different Poe homes that have been demolished over the years. And one of our buildings is actually made of the pieces from one of his childhood homes. We saved the bricks, the staircase, the mantels, the woodwork, the door frames, and rebuilt them 6 blocks down the street from their original site. This was back in 1927. They moved all the pieces down there. But even the garden, the shrine in the garden is made on the first floor of the office where he used to work when he was editing the Southern Literary Messenger. And these originally were daguerreotypes. So we actually have this daguerreotype in our collection, although the original, we've zoomed in on it, but it does go down about waist level, and it's kind of a formal daguerreotype. He didn't pay to have it done. This was done up in Providence, Rhode Island, and You can tell he's in pretty rough shape in this picture. He just proposed to a woman up there 3 times in a row, and she turned him down 3 times in a row. So he was depressed and miserable. He'd even swallowed a bunch of laudanum, a vial of laudanum, which was a painkiller made of opium and alcohol. Usually take a few drops that'll cure your backache, your toothache, your headache. He swallowed the bottle. And he threw it up, so that's why he survived. But then her friends took him out drinking to cheer him up. So here he is 4 days later. And that woman, her name is Sarah Helen Whitman. After this, she did agree to marry him. But she said, I'll marry you on one condition. If you ever touch alcohol again, the wedding's off. So they're engaged for 1 month. But she always liked this photo of him, so she had copies of it made. She thought this was the best picture of him because it looks like he's been to the end of the world and back. And those other daguerreotypes I showed you earlier on, another was taken in Providence. He had 2 taken in Providence. He had 2 taken in Richmond. He had a couple taken in New York City. And usually they're taken at the request of lady friends of his. So he couldn't really afford to have these taken. So the names of them are usually the names of the women he took them for, like the Annie daguerreotype he took for Annie Richmond, or the Stella he took for Stella Lewis, or the Whitman he took for Sarah Helen Whitman. You're welcome. But he knew how to pose for his pictures.
Do we have any more questions? I'll put that in. It's actually a good idea. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to thank Chris for coming and presenting, and people who are watching on the broadcast. I will definitely look into having an excursion soon. And yeah, thank you all for coming out, and have a good night.
Bye. Thanks for coming. There's the cats. It's Edgar and Pluto. That's Edgar and Pluto over and over again. Well, thank you. Well, thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for the introduction. Okay, we'll look out for you.